Hey, New City, welcome back. We're back at it, continuing our series, I Once Was. We're going to pick up where we left off last time. We're going to be going back to Romans 4. We're going to unpack the idea of righteousness and the idea of faith. I want to bring you in on a situation, something that I've been reflecting on, something that's been happening with me or to me. Something that I've only realized recently is an issue. You know how sometimes you can have this one thing that when you go to bed, it comes to the surface of your mind and it keeps you up at night. Well, more recently, I want to say maybe over the last 2 months or so, every once in a while, this thought creeps into my mind and I start processing it. So I want to bring you into it because I'm curious whether this happens in your world as well. Whether this happens in your mind. I'll let you be the judge as to whether I'm being too sensitive, whether I'm just like way out there, or whether you can relate to this. I should add that this is something I'm recognizing has existed in my life for a long time. Like I may be recognizing it more now, but as I sit with it, I start to recognize, man, this has been here for a very long time. Okay, let me bring you right into it. Let's go back to when I want to say about 11 or 12, maybe somewhere between the ages of 10 and 12. I know last time we were chatting and sharing, I referenced this period of my life as well. I'm doing it again. My birthday was coming up, or my birthday came up December, and I went to church, and my birthday happened to land on like a Sunday morning. It was awesome. I loved that because when I was 10, 11, 12, I loved celebrating my birthdays. It was a big deal for me. So anyways, I go to church, and we've been attending this church in the Netherlands for quite a while. My dad is pastoring there. I feel like we're pretty well connected to the people there. And I feel like, man, people are going to celebrate my birthday. So we go, and sure enough, they sing happy birthday, and people are bringing up gifts. And then this one particular family comes up to me after the service is done and says, hey, Wamba, we have a gift for you that we think you're really going to like. And so maybe when church is like completely done, if you can meet us in the parking lot and we'll hand this over to you. Now, this is a family that we were quite close with. Like I'd spent many nights doing sleepovers at their place with their children. Their children were a little older than me, but I always liked hanging out with the older kids. And so we were really close. So I was excited. Naturally, I'm like, this is going to be an amazing gift. So when church is done, I walk outside with my parents to their car. I was expecting maybe like a book, maybe like a game. This is when I was like playing my PS2. So excitedly, I kind of start unwrapping it and tearing it apart. And lo and behold, this God-loving family has given me a gift they think I'm going to like, and lo and behold, is a rat. A pet rat. Like what? Who gives a child a pet rat as a gift? And maybe you're into like hamsters or stuff like that. And if you are, I got respect for that. I'm not. But never mind like a hamster. What about a rat? Who gives a rat, a rodent, a dirty, filthy rodent to a child as a gift? I was so stunned and confused. I'm like, is this a joke? Like, are you insulting me or are you trying to gift me? Who gives a rat as a gift? So, I mean, I've been brought up that like when someone gives you a gift, you say thank you. And so what did I do? I said, thank you so much. We took the rat home. And I've got my Stuart Little at home, and I'm like, what am I supposed to do with this? And I told my parents, I think we're gonna have to give this back. And sure enough, we actually gave the gift back to them because there was no way on God's green earth that I was going to be keeping a pet rat as a gift. But here's what stunned me, okay? Here's my dilemma. What was I doing in the time that they had known me? What had I communicated? What had they perceived from me that made them think I would want a rat as a gift? Like, did we once see a rat or a mouse outside? Did I go, ooh, that's nice? Like, what about me communicated to them that's a gift I would enjoy? To this very day, I mean, I guess I've forgiven them, but I would never forget. This is a core memory. I probably got lots of really good other gifts that year. I don't remember what they are. This tragic, traumatic experience overshadows any good gifts I got that year. I just remember asking myself, I thought these people knew me. How did they not know that a rat would be a terrible gift for me? Anyways, the reason I bring that up is because that's existed for a while. That was when I was like 10, 11, or 12. Anyways, I have this experience a couple months ago. My pants are starting to rip. Not because I'm like, my waist is getting bigger. They're just old pants. I buy my clothing, I wear it for years, or shoes, I buy them for years. And I only really decide to buy new ones when they start to rip. So sure enough, my jeans are old. I've had them for multiple years. They're ripping. So I go to the mall with my girl. I go to my go-to spot, Aeropostale. I pick a couple jeans. I get in the fitting room. I put on a pair of jeans, and then I do the thing that everybody does in the fitting room. I do a little like turn to the left, a little turn to the right, look in the mirror, strut it a little bit. If you don't do that in a changing room, you are lying. Everybody does that in the changing room. I do this and I'm like, these pants are not really working for me. But let me get some opinions. So I open up the door of the fitting room and I asked my girl, I'm like, what do you think of these? And she's like, oh man, they look great. I'm like, man, I don't know. I'm not sure. I think we need a third opinion. So one of the workers, one of the young girls that's there, I'd put her about maybe, I want to say 24. Like she looks like she's the age of my youngest sister who is 6 years younger than me. I think she's somewhere around the age of 23 or 24. And I ask her, I'm like, listen, I don't think these are working for me. My girl says they're working for me. What about you? What do you think? And she goes, oh no, those are great. I'm like, really? You don't think they're a little funky around the knees, around the ankles a little bit? She's like, no, those look great. That looks like something my dad would wear. What? That looks like something my dad would wear? How old does she think I am? This is a salesperson that is trained to sell clothing to people and to use every skill she has available to her to deduct what someone like me would want. And in her mind, she made the conclusion, oh, if I want this guy to buy these pants, I should tell him it looks good and reinforce my point with the thought that my dad would wear this. What about me made this girl think that I want to look the same as a 40, 50-year-old man? How is she complimenting me or insulting me? Needless to say, I don't buy the jeans. I'm not having it. I walk out of the store. I'm like, I'm not shopping for jeans anymore. I think my ego's been hurt. So now I'm shopping for shoes. I walk into, I think, the Nike store and I'm looking for running shoes. I normally just buy running shoes from like Walmart. It's $25, $30. That does the trick for me. But apparently, if I really want to get into running, I need to get proper running shoes. So here I am in the Nike store. I'm trying out these different shoes. I put this pair on and I'm like, I don't know if these look right on me. I asked my girl, she says, no, they look great on you. I'm like, I don't know. Let's try a third opinion again. So one of the workers comes by and I ask him, I say, listen, man, what do you think of these shoes? And this is what the worker says to me. Now, just for context again, this guy that's working there, I'd put him at like maybe 16 or 17, like 17 max. He goes, boy, those look good on you. Boy? Did he just call me boy? I easily have 15 years on this brother and he decided to call me boy. I'm wondering what about me communicated to this guy that he could call me boy? I mean, let's get real around here. I don't want to say respect your elders because it's not like I'm an elder, but I got 15 years on you, son. You can't call me boy. You've only known me for a total of maybe 30 seconds, maybe 45 seconds. What in these 45 seconds communicated to you that you can call me boy? This was a bad day for me. So I shared that with you because I want you to be the judge of these situations. Am I overreacting? And I'm also curious, have you experienced this? But maybe not these specific situations. Have you ever experienced a situation where people's perception of you is way off from who you are or who you think you are? Have you ever had people say things about you where you like hear something secondhand and you're like, what? Someone said that about me, like that's so opposite to who I am. How did they land there? How did they get to that conclusion? How did they have that perception of me? Have you ever experienced that in your life where someone's perception of you is way off from who you really are. Talk about that. We're going to tie this into Romans 4 in a moment, but I just want to get your mind thinking. So talk about that in your house churches. Okay, here's what I'd love to do. I want to read Romans 4 again. I know last time I read the whole chapter. I'm going to read the whole chapter again today. We spent a little bit of time unpacking mostly the first half of Romans 4. We were jumping around a little bit and really pulling out concepts and ideas from the whole chapter. The purpose of our session today, of our time today, is to do a recap of what we talked about, but then I really want to make things practical. I'll mention this over and over and over again. If what we're learning here does not translate into something practical, then it just stays head knowledge. And we're not interested in simply becoming disciples that are focused just on information. We're really focused on the idea of transformation. How is walking with Jesus in community transforming me internally, spiritually? How is it transforming me more into Jesus, more into the image of who God has created me to be? That's why we gather together, so we can sharpen each other and build up each other and encourage each other and point each other towards Jesus. So let's jump into Romans 4, verse 1, and let's go all the way through. Abraham was, humanly speaking, the founder of our Jewish nation. What did he discover about being made right with God? Pause right there. Being made right with God. That's a key statement. As we know, this passage is talking about the righteousness of God. What's another way you could actually define what righteousness is? Simply that. Being made right with God, having good standing with God. If his good deeds have made him acceptable to God, he would have had something to boast about. But that was not God's way. For the scriptures tell us Abraham believed God and God counted him as righteous because of his faith. When people work, their wages are not a gift, but something they have earned. But people are counted as righteous, not because of their work, but because of their faith in God who forgives sinners. Verse 6, David also spoke of this when he described the happiness of those who were declared righteous without working for it. And then Paul quotes David, "Oh, what joy for those whose disobedience is forgiven, whose sins are put out of sight. Yes, what joy for those whose record the Lord has cleared of sin." Now, is this blessing only for the Jews, or is it also for uncircumcised Gentiles? Well, we have been saying that Abraham was counted as righteous by God because of his faith. But how did this happen? Was he counted as righteous only after he was circumcised? Or was it before he was circumcised? Clearly, God accepted Abraham before he was circumcised. And last week we looked at this. We looked at Genesis 15, where God gives Abraham a promise. Abraham believes, and in that moment, right then, God gives him the status of righteousness. And then it's 2 chapters later where God actually gives this instruction to Abraham to get circumcised. And so we looked at the history and said that's why Paul can say clearly righteousness was given to Abraham before he got circumcised. Verse 11, circumcision was a sign that Abraham already had faith that God had already accepted him and declared him to be righteous, even before he was circumcised. So, Abraham is the spiritual father of those who have faith, but have not been circumcised. They are counted as righteous because of their faith. And Abraham is also the spiritual father of those who have been circumcised, but only if they have the same kind of faith Abraham had before he was circumcised. Pause again. Recap. We see here how because Abraham was given righteousness before he followed through with obedience in this command that God gave him, in this ceremony that God wanted the Jewish people to perform as a way of signifying they're members of God's family. We see how Abraham was given righteousness before all of that. And Paul is making the argument that because Abraham was given that before this membership ritual, that means the same is true for Gentiles, for non-Jewish people, that we can have righteousness with God, not because of some ceremony, but because of believing in God and what he says. Okay, verse 13. Clearly, God's promise to give the whole earth to Abraham and his descendants was based not on his obedience to God's law, but on a right relationship with God that comes by faith. We're referencing back what we saw in verse 2 there, in verse 1, being made right with God, right relationship with God. You want those words to kind of stay in your mind as you read through this passage. If God's promise is only for those who obey the law, then faith is not necessary, and the promise is pointless. For the law always brings punishment on those who try to obey it. The only way to avoid breaking the law is to have no law to break. So, the promise of salvation is received by faith. It is given as a free gift, and we are all certain to receive it whether or not we live according to the law of Moses, if we have faith like Abraham's. For Abraham is the father of all who believe. That means Abraham is the father of you and I. As Christians in the 21st century, Abraham is the spiritual father of all who believe. That includes us. That is what the scriptures mean when God told him, "I have made you the father of many nations." This happened because Abraham believed in the God who brings the dead back to life and who creates new things out of nothing. We're going to come back to that. Even when there was no reason for hope, Abraham kept hoping, believing that he would become the father of many nations. For God said to him, "That's how many descendants you will have." We looked at how in Genesis, God had called Abraham out and said, "Look at the stars. That's how many descendants you would have. Look at the grains of the sand. That's how many descendants you're going to have." And Abraham's faith did not weaken, even though at about 100 years of age, he figured his body was as good as dead, not just broken, as good as dead, and so was Sarah's womb. Abraham never wavered in believing God's promise. In fact, his faith grew stronger, and in this he brought glory to God. He was fully convinced that God is able to do whatever he promises. And because of Abraham's faith, God counted him as righteous. It wasn't just for Abraham's benefit, it was recorded for our benefit too, assuring us that God will also count us as righteous if we believe in him, the one who raised Jesus our Lord from the dead. He was handed over to die because of our sins, and he was raised to life to make us right with God. So we spent some time unpacking this last week. The key points we took away from this is we get righteousness, the status or the label of righteousness, simply by believing that God will do what he says. One of the questions I want us to ask right now in this space is, why is righteousness such a big deal? Why is it such a big deal to be made right with God? See, this entire passage really does not matter if your understanding is being made right with God is not of importance to me. It's not something that's of high priority to me. If you're not seeking to be reconciled with God, then none of this is actually good news. Then none of this actually matters for your life. And so the question I think we should ask for a moment is, why is righteousness such a big deal? Why is it so important for us to be made right with God? Explore that in your house churches for a moment. Now, you don't have a lot of time for this. Today, we're going to have a few activities that are going to be practical that I would love for us to engage in to really drive home the idea of faith. But before we do that, I think it would be awesome for us to discuss, why is righteousness such a big deal? Why is it so important to be made right with God? I'm curious what your answer to that question was or what you discussed in your group. I'd really love to hear what came to the surface for each person in the group. But one of the things we can gather about righteousness is a big deal to God. As Christians, we believe that God is righteous, that he can't help but be righteous. Like that is his nature. He's not bound to some kind of external rule that stops him from being righteous. Like it's inside of him. It's who he is, and he can't contradict himself. He is righteous. But here's what I'd love for us to do. Rather than just going, okay, that's true, let's move on. I'd love for us to sit with the evidence that we have of that. If righteousness is a big deal to God, then righteousness is a big deal to us. But how do we know that righteousness is a big deal to God? So let's jump back to Genesis 1, and we see how God creates the earth. God creates the universe. I mean, that itself is just like, whoa. We're dealing here with a creature that is way outside of what we can ever imagine. He created absolutely everything. We're talking about the earth. We're talking about the galaxies. We're talking about space. He created it all. And then if you jump forwards to Genesis 2 and 3, we see how God creates people, human beings. He creates us. He creates Adam and Eve. Now, in Genesis 3, Adam and Eve sin. They go against what God said. They go against what God had instructed to them. They chose to believe an outside voice instead of believing what God said. They chose to believe the serpent as opposed to choosing to believe what God said. As a result, we see how humans are put into the state of not being right with God. There's a break here. God himself is fully righteous, but humans are no longer in right standing with God because we've chosen to listen to a voice other than God and put our faith and trust in what something else or what somebody else said instead of what God said. This is already present from the very beginning of humans existing. This idea of, oh man, we're not right with God anymore because we put our faith somewhere else. The humans are cast out of the Garden of Eden. And as a result, there's multiple consequences. We see in Genesis 3 how all of a sudden now everything's going to hurt a little more. Everything's going to be a little harder. It's not going to be this great experience that we were promised or that we thought we could have based on what we experienced in the garden from the very beginning. So the very fact that God is like, man, I can't be in full communion with you, that itself is evidence number one that righteousness is a big deal to God. So much so that not putting our faith in God results in separation from God. This particular part of our series we're calling I Once Was Separated. For every single human being, there was a moment and a time where we did not have access to God, where we were separated from God. But last week we talked about how God had this master plan to reconcile humans to himself. His desire has never been punishment. His desire has never been eternal separation. God's desire has always been to have unity and communion with the creatures he created. He created us in his image. He sees a reflection of himself in us, and he wants unity with us. We know when we look at the grand scheme that Jesus comes about to make us right with God. But it's important that we trace back the very beginning of things and go, wait a second, I can see based on just even the very beginning that righteousness is a big deal to God. Let's go to our second piece of evidence. If we look at the words and teachings of Jesus as he's walking on the earth, this is what Jesus has to say. So if we look at Matthew 5, verse 17, this is Jesus teaching. This is the Sermon of the Mount. This is a famous sermon of Jesus. Verse 17, don't misunderstand why I have come. I did not come to abolish the law of Moses or the writings of the prophets. No, I came to accomplish their purpose. I tell you the truth, until heaven and earth disappear, not even the smallest detail of God's law would disappear until its purpose is achieved. So, If you ignore the least commandment and teach others to do the same, you will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. But anyone who obeys God's laws and teaches them will be called great in the kingdom of heaven. But, this is where you want to pay attention. I warn you, unless your righteousness is better than the righteousness of the teachers of the religious law and the Pharisees, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Jesus is using strong language, he's communicating a strong idea here. He points at the Pharisees and the religious leaders of his time who thought that righteousness with God is earned by works. That's what they taught. Jesus here even references, hey, listen, you're teaching the wrong thing. He says, don't be like them. If you think your righteousness is like that, you're going to miss it. He says your righteousness needs to be greater than that. Don't look for righteousness through your works. Look for righteousness through faith in me, through faith in Jesus. So we see here how righteousness is a big deal to Jesus and to God. Jesus communicates, unless your righteousness is different from this version of righteousness, you cannot enter or be a part of the kingdom of heaven. So we have the evidence from Genesis, and there is way more evidence even between Genesis and the book of Matthew. But these are key markers. We have humans being cast out of the Garden of Eden. We have Jesus walking on the earth and communicating, hey, listen, God wants you to pursue righteousness. He wants you to be righteous. This is some overlap with what we discussed last week, but I want to make sure you really understand this point. Now, the reason I want to stress this is because if we believe that righteousness comes through faith, then we need to talk a great deal about faith. And my challenge to us today is, what does it look like for us to strengthen our faith? What does it look like for us to explore our faith? What are the practical, tangible tools that we can equip ourselves with to ensure that we are walking and living in faith? If faith is the key to righteousness, to being made right with God, then faith is a big deal. So what are the thoughts that come to mind for you? What does it look like to step into a lifestyle of faith? What does it look like to look at the reality of the world around you and see it through the lens of faith? I want to propose 3 different things that I think are worth sitting with and holding down on and saying, I am going to embrace these 3 practical tools to help me explore my faith. So let's look at the first practical tool. Paul references Abraham. Let's look at the life of Abraham for a moment, and let's see how Abraham had faith. Let's look at the key things that stand out from his faith journey and how that can be a practical, tangible tool for us. Look at Genesis 24. So Abram was now a very old man, and the Lord had blessed him in every way. One day, Abraham said to his oldest servant, the man in charge of his household, take an oath by putting your hand under my thigh. We're just going to take that as it is for now and maybe dive into the context of that and the cultural context on another day. Swear by the Lord, the God of heaven and earth, that you will not allow my son to marry one of these local Canaanite women. Go instead to my homeland, to my relatives, and find a wife there for my son Isaac. He's given some last wishes of some things that are really important to him and for the Jewish nation. The servant asked, but what if I can't find a young woman who is willing to travel so far from home? Should I then take Isaac there to live among your relatives in the land you came from? So the servant is asking a really good question here. Abraham was given this invitation from God, this commandment from God to leave his homeland and to go where God was sending him. And to do that because God needed to do that to make him the father of many nations. So this question that the servant asks is a key question because he's like, wait, if I can't find a woman that's willing to travel all the way, should we go back where you came from? And in the life of Abraham, going back was not an option. We see how there's different stories where looking back is not something that God is calling Abraham to do. So here's Abraham's response. No, Abraham responded. Be careful never to take my son there. And then verse 7 is key. For the Lord, the God of heaven, took me from my father's house and my native land, solemnly promised to give this land to my descendants. He will send his angel ahead of you, and he will see to it that you find a wife there for my son. If she's unwilling to come back with you, then you're free from this oath of mine, but under no circumstance are you to take my son there. Now, it's easy to read that passage and go, okay, well, that's just a conversation between Abraham and his servant. But there is so much we can learn about Abram's faith from this passage. He says, no, don't take my son back. My instructions that God has given me require that my family keeps moving and doesn't go back to where we came from. And then he quotes something, or he references something that's really key. In verse 7, he says, for the Lord, the God of heaven. Just pause right there. Abram, right off the bat, voices who he knows God to be. He is the God of heaven. He is the ruler of the universe. There is no one above him. If he's the God of heaven, there can be no one above him. He is Lord over all. Abraham voices, this is who God is. This is Abram's perception of who God is. I'm tying this back to the question I asked earlier. Have you ever had moments where people's perception of you is like way off from what you think you are or know yourself to be? And if we have a wrong understanding, Paul talks about this again in Romans as well. If we have a wrong understanding of who God is, then we find ourselves in all kind of tricky places. But I wonder if the key, or one of the first tools we can actually dive into when trying to build our faith and strengthen our faith and explore our faith, is actually just simply get to know who God is. Abraham had such a strong conviction, knowledge, understanding, and revelation of who God is, that when the servant asked, well, what if we can't find anyone? Abraham goes, wait a second. Let me tell you where my trust is. My trust is first off in the Lord, the God of heaven. Then he continues on, who took me from my father's house and my native land, solemnly promised to give this land to my descendants. So there he references something that God had spoken, a promise that God had given. And Abraham knows God so well that he goes, listen, God promised this. And I trust God's promises because I know his character. I know his attributes. Therefore, I trust what he says. My trust is that God has already provided what is necessary. My faith and trust is in God. And so I think the first tangible tool we need to embrace is get to know who God is. What is your perception of who God is? Is it possible that you have a perception of God that has been formed by outside sources rather than sources like God himself? Is it possible that you've allowed other people's experiences and only other people's experiences to define who God is, and not actually spent enough time for yourself sitting down and saying, God, I want to get to know who you are? What does it look like for you and I to take time and be intentional about getting to know who God is? Sometimes we tackle the idea of understanding how God would respond to something, or what God's thoughts are on something based on what we think. We go, well, because I am this, maybe because I'm a dad, or maybe because I'm a mom, or maybe because I have this experience, and because I see things this way, and maybe because this is what I would do with my children, therefore I think God would do a similar thing. Now, it's very true that we can see parts of God in us, and so it's not wrong to look at ourselves and go, I can see God in that. That's not completely inaccurate. However, that's not the full picture. And sometimes we develop theologies and outlooks on life that are actually based on what we think God is like by looking at ourselves instead of looking at God. And so the challenge for us to go, wait a second, who is God? How do I get to know who he is without even inserting myself into the picture? How do I look at God himself and go directly to the source and learn who God is? So, in your house church, I want to invite you to engage with this exercise. I want to drive this point home. I would love to create a space where we each can take some time and reflect on who God is, who we understand Him to be. We've been exploring one specific attribute of God, righteousness. There are so many other attributes of God. I want you to sit for a moment and use the sticky notes that have been provided in your house church and write down the attributes of God that that come to mind for you, that you appreciate. But here's what's really important. Don't just write down the attributes of God that you're like, I like these. Don't just write down the things that you're like, man, these are awesome, but these other ones are not so great. The idea here is to explore who God is holistically as a whole. God is love. God is just. God is mercy and grace. God requires righteousness. What are the attributes of God that stand out to you? I actually encourage you as a group to maybe even look at scripture, discuss them as a group, talk about the attributes that you're seeing. And then your house church leader is going to walk you through this. But at the right time, take your sticky notes, and I'd love for you to stick them up on the pieces of paper that are up in the room right now. Stick them up wherever you can and have that as a collage that kind of displays what your house church group believes God is, who God is. Step into that, and then we'll continue from there. All right, here's our second practical tool, or second element we need to engage with if we want to strengthen our faith and build our faith and step into a life of living by faith. Number one, get to know who God is. And again, I can't stress that enough. I hope as you spend time in the exercise we just did in our house churches, I hope this idea of affirming within yourself and to others who God is, I hope that does something to your heart and to your spirit. All right, the second thing we need to embrace is something that Paul references when he talks about Abraham. In verse 18, he says this: even when there was no reason for hope, Abraham kept hoping, believing that he would become the father of many nations. For God had said to him, that's how many descendants you will have. And Abraham's faith did not weaken, even though at about 100 years of age, he figured his body was as good as dead, and so was Sarah's womb. Abraham never wavered in believing God's promise. In fact, his faith grew stronger, and in this he brought glory to God. He was fully convinced that God is able to do whatever he promises. And because of Abraham's faith, God counted him as righteous. It says here that Abraham never wavered. Last week, we talked about how it seems like Abraham did waver, though. There was a moment where he decided to step outside of God's plan and fulfill this promise through a different creative method. Sarah said, why don't you sleep with one of my servants and have a child that way instead? And Abraham followed through with that. So you could make the argument that his faith wavered, but that seems to clash with what Paul's communicating here. So what's happening here? And the key thing we need to pay attention to is even though Abraham's actions weren't perfect, even though he had his moments of doubt, even though he stepped into mistakes, his faith remained intact. Because even after those mistakes, he came back and said, wait a minute, God promised something, and I'm not perfect, but God is perfect. What's another attribute of God? God is perfect. Therefore, despite my mistakes, my failures, and my doubt, I know God will do what he promised because that's who he is, and I'm putting my faith back in that. That's the lifestyle Abraham lived. And so if you read this passage and think, well, Abraham never doubted, well, that's not accurate. But it says that Abraham's faith never wavered because he kept coming back to a place where he said, despite my failures, God will do what he said. Faith is looking at who God is, not who we are. And so Abraham actually acted out on his faith and acted out on the promises that he believed God gave to him. So the second thing I think we need to embrace is act on the promises God has given you. Now, what does that look like? And we want to be careful here not to dive into promises that are actually not from God. This is where things sometimes get a little tricky, a little dicey. Sometimes we believe, well, God gave me the promise that this year I am going to have $1 million. God gave me the promise that this year I'm going to do this. Now, God could possibly do that. I would never pretend like I can rule out what God has spoken to you. But what I do know based on God's character, what we do know based on what we have in Scripture, is that God is actually way more concerned about the inner workings of us and what's happening on the inside than trying to make us comfortable. As a matter of fact, if you look at the life of Jesus, Jesus actually promises suffering. If you look at what was communicated to early Christians, when they said yes to Jesus, it was similar to places in the world now where you get persecuted. You're not saying yes to an easy, comfortable life. You're not saying yes to a life that's just going to be full of prosperity. You're saying yes to a life with God, peace with God, unity with God, hope with God, but you're not saying yes to an easy life. So it's worth looking at the promises that you think you have from God and going, wait a second, is this actually a promise from God? Or is this simply a promise that I think brings me into a place of prosperity or a place of comfort? Is this actually a promise from God? And then as you assess God's promises, act upon them. Now, the first promise we should look at is the promise of salvation. God gives the promise of salvation. That's what we're reading here in the book of Romans. What does it look like for you to act on that? What are the actions that come out of your life? What's the lifestyle you develop when you act on the promise that God has given, that salvation has been given to you and that it's not going away tomorrow, and that it'll be present for you even after death, where we can be forever united with God? What are you doing with that promise? How are you acting on the promises of God? So what I'd love for you to do right now is now do this personal exercise. We just did an exercise that was maybe a little more shared. I'd love for you to step into this exercise now, where you write down some of the promises you believe God has given you, some of the promises for your heart, for your mind, for your soul. And then I want you to reflect on what it looks like to act on them. Maybe simply how you adjust your speech. Maybe it's actually specific action you need to take. But what does it look like for you to act on your faith? I said there was 3 tools. We did the first one. We're looking at the second one now. We don't have time to go through the third one. I'm going to save that for next week. So spend time reflecting just on this specific tool of embracing and walking in your faith. And then after that, take time and close off in prayer.